Now you've got Paul on the road to Damascus. This guy's the guy. And boom, he does a 180. He is convinced that Jesus of Nazareth makes a physical appearance to him.
Well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm one of the co-founders of the club. I'm a Christian apologist, president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical organization focused mostly on interfaith apologetics and evangelism. I co-founded the book club with Bill Cluck. The book club has been going about 5 years now. We are a monthly get-together of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. So we usually alternate a book, atheist book 1 month, Christian book the next month. And I'm going to pitch over to our other co-founder in just a moment. I did very, very excited about this month's guest author, Mark Lanier. Mark has been called a superstar amongst plaintiffs' lawyers by the National Law Journal. He's an acclaimed trial attorney and founder of the Lanier Law Firm with offices in New York, Texas, and California. He's a frequent guest on television, shows such as CNBC's Squawk Box, Fox News' Your World with Neil Cavuto, and Fox Business News, Varney and Company with Stuart Varney. In 2010, he founded the Lanier Theological Library, one of the nation's largest private theological collections, which houses over 70,000 biblical artifacts, books, museum-quality reproductions of ancient documents. His background before law school was in biblical studies and Greek and Hebrew. He's an ordained minister. He teaches a weekly 750-member Sunday school class at Champion Forest Baptist Church in North Houston. And he also founded the Christian Trial Lawyers Association, a network of principled attorneys who minister to others through civic-minded endeavors. Mark, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
It's a delight to be here.
That might change soon.
Well, it is respectful. Now, we have had like maybe 2 book clubs that got a little out of control over the years, but by and large, it is a very respectful conversation. Some good back and forth. We want hard-hitting questions. We want tough questions, but just as long as it's fair, and that's what we almost always get. So our other co-founder is my friend Bill Cluck. Bill's a former Christian turned atheist, and this was kind of a brainchild we had really about 6 years ago. We started talking about it, launched it a little over 5 years ago. So Bill, I'm going to give you a shot first to ask a question or two of Mark. What you got for him?
Okay, we're talking about the book Atheism on Trial, which had some great points. You mentioned that atheists steal from God or steal from the Christian value when they're talking about the morality, which I thought was a good point. You're familiar, Frank Turek wrote the book Stealing from God.
I have not read it, no.
Well, he made pretty much the same point you did, and I can understand, your point of view that atheists, and you've heard of the Alvin Plantinga's argument that since we're atheists and we don't have any, it's just happenstance that we get where we're at. Evolution is a random process, so you can evolutionary argument against naturalism. Have you heard of that?
Yes, and I've read a lot of Plantinga.
What do you think of that argument?
Well, it is an interesting situation, because what you've got to do is you've got to start with cosmic space dust, okay? And what that cosmic space dust has supposedly done is coagulated itself into certain atoms, which have then somehow coagulated themselves into certain molecules, which have jettisoned themselves around the universe in such a way that they've coagulated themselves into greater combinations of stuffs, ultimately becoming, in our solar system, comets and meteors and planets.
Right. If you start off with hydrogen, you get 2 supernova explosions. Basically, God, none wanted, none needed, right?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that at all, because you started out with hydrogen and you got to explain where that comes from.
Well, let's just take that as for granted. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But I'm saying, you know those arguments. And so, but what you've got to do is you've got to now make a quantum leap, because somehow you've got to say that in the process of this, you've still got to get to life. And once you get to life, you've got to get to life that's progressing out of chance and time into a life that now has a humanity that arguably has some morality that came out of evolution. Now, how did we get there? This is not a new thing that Turek started asking, or Plantinga started asking, or Lanier started asking. Back in my Greek studies, anybody, though, you didn't have to take Greek, have a Greek degree to do this. You can go back and read Euthyphro, the story of Euthyphro and Socrates, which was written by Socrates' student Plato. And it's a fascinating story, because it asked the very question. And so the story is one where Socrates is headed down to the agora where he's going to stand trial. He's going to stand trial for corrupting the youth of Athens. And we know historically he'll be found guilty and he'll get the death penalty for corrupting youth. Meanwhile, there's a youth named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is headed to court, if you will, at the agora also, and he stumbles upon Socrates. And Socrates says to Socrates, "Aren't you Socrates?" "Well, yes, I am. Who are you?" "I'm Euthyphro." "Well, Euthyphro, where are you headed?" "I'm headed to court." "Where are you going, Socrates?" "Well, I'm headed to court." "Euthyphro, tell me why you're going to court." Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm going to court because I've got to see my dad put to death." And Socrates says, "Well, what on earth did your dad do?" And he said, "My dad violated morality." And he had the moral story to back it up. And Socrates says to him, "Okay, well, whose morality did he violate?" And the irony, of course, in Plato is Socrates, who's being tried and ultimately convicted for corrupting the youth, is trying to rehabilitate youth along the way. But the ethicists of today, if you were to take a basic ethics class, you would read this as Euthyphro's dilemma, because here's the dilemma. Socrates says, "Well, who says your dad was immoral?" Euthyphro says, "I say it." And Socrates says, "Well, how do you get to decide what's moral?" And he says, "Well, okay, well, maybe the community decides." And Socrates says, "So is every community right in what they decide? What about the community that winds up changing its mind? Does morality change?" And he says, "Okay, well, maybe it's not the community, maybe it's what the gods decide." And Socrates says, "But the gods fuss and fight among themselves, and they're jealous and they fight, and one god will say one thing and one god will say the other. Which god decides morality?" And Euthyphro says, "Oh, that's a good point too. How about if it's the majority of the gods?" He says, "Well, what if the majority of the gods change their mind?" And Euthyphro says, "But the gods are good." So, and then Socrates asks the question, which is Euthyphro's dilemma. Do we say the gods are good because they do good things? Or do we say the things they do are good because they're done by the gods? How do we define morality? Now, if you want to argue that morality is something that's just a product of evolution, then you're really stuck when it comes to determining that Hitler and the Nazis are immoral. Because Hitler and the Nazis actually had, if you take God out of the picture, actually had quite a moral view that I don't know that any of us would fuss with. Hitler's position was, we have limited resources. There is limited food stuff. There's limited natural resources. There are limited opportunities. Our obligation to the human species is to see that we continue to evolve to become Nietzsche's Übermensch, to become Nietzsche's Superman. And so that we're able in the future to look back on the humanity we are today, the way our humanity today looks back on chimps and monkeys. We have no trouble experimenting on chimps and monkeys, even though they're primates, because they're lesser than us. And in the future, the Superman will have no trouble experimenting on people today because they're lesser than the Superman. So if we've got limited food stores, stuff, and we've got limited opportunities and we've got limited resources, let's spend them on the genetically superior and don't let the genetically inferior drain us of that. We will greater accelerate human evolution, and that's the moral thing to do. Now,
okay.
What do you say to that?
No, that's an excellent point. Let me get into your book. On page 105, you say the biblical account that explains the condition of humanity is first the story in the Garden of Eden. You seem to think that Genesis is historical and that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Nobody believes that anymore. And you interviewed William Lane Craig, and he calls this mytho-history, right? Are you familiar with his latest book, In Quest of the Atom?
Yeah. I know William Lane Craig.
So if you don't, and here's one of the big shots, and he's the foremost Christian apologist. If he doesn't believe Genesis is history and Moses is myth, then what foundation do you have for morality? It's certainly not the Bible, is it?
Well, let me tell you that I know William Lane Craig, and I disagree with him on a great many number of things. I don't take him as the paradigm, and I would suspect you disagree with him on a number of things as well.
I like what he said about mytho-history, though.
Yeah, well, so if you'll read the end of my book, you'll see that I talk about Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation account, and I do it in a very different fashion than your fundamentalists do and than your creationists do, because I don't believe that it's there to teach science. I believe that it's there to teach. I don't think God was trying to correct Moses's science. I think he was working on Moses's theology. And so I try to read those within the context of when they were written. If you'll look at people like John Walton, who's a much better scholar on this than William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig, nothing personal. His Old Testament studies are really pretty poor. I don't think he can even read Hebrew, much less translate it, much less understand it. I don't think he's published on Hebrew, and I don't think he would know the Pentateuch itself, for example. Clearly Moses did not write the entirety of the Pentateuch. I don't believe that. I don't know anybody who believes it. I mean, the Pentateuch records the death of Moses and things after he died. Yeah. Clearly he didn't write that. The Pentateuch has some vocabulary in it. That is vocabulary that's not from the era of Moses. So clearly it's been worked on by people, I would say, who are prophets of Almighty God, who have done it under the oversight, if you will, of God and his Spirit. But I think that you don't read Genesis 1 and 2 and say that is literal and the earth is 4,000 years BC, it's a 6,000-year-old earth. I don't believe that it's saying that at all. And yet, I do believe that it's telling compelling stories that are to inform us of who we are, who God is, what he created us to be, and why we are not who we could be and should be. And those are fundamental questions that all of us are asking, or you wouldn't be in this book club.
Yes. So you're old Earth, right?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. So I'm dying to ask you this, since you're a lawyer and an expert on this. One of the problems we have, let's go to the New Testament now.
Okay.
Paul says that Jesus appeared to 500, some of whom are still living. So
Right.
place yourself as the attorney, okay? And you have Paul, a tightly wound, complex, repressed homosexual with all sorts of crazy things going on. And by the way, Paul is the co-founder of Christianity. We inherited Pauline Christianity, not Jesus Christianity. Jesus wasn't the first Christian. So anyway, what would you say if, because we can't cross-examine the 500, we don't have their birth dates, we don't have their testimony, as a lawyer, wouldn't you feel like you'd like something more?
Well, let me first of all deload the question, if you don't, if you don't mind. I think there's a good indication Paul was married. So he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and the law says you couldn't be a member of the Sanhedrin if you weren't married. So the idea that he's a repressed homosexual, I think is a bit far-fetched. I'm about 70% through with the book defending Paul. I've got a publisher lined up and everything. And so maybe in a year or two, we could do that book. It's premised on the idea if when Paul was arrested in Jerusalem through the wonders of time travel, he were able to hire me to be his lawyer, could I have gotten him off? And it's a book that I love Paul. I would argue that God is the founder of Christianity, and Paul was one of the headlights on that car. There's no question he was one of the headlights. Of course, without the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, Paul's just an absolute nutwagon. Here's a guy who's got everything in the world going for him. He's a student of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel was the guru of gurus, and Gamaliel in Jerusalem in the temple cult. Gamaliel would only take one student at a time. Now, we know all of this from Judaic materials that we've still got. This is not out of biblical stuff. This is out of the Midrash and various Judaic materials that we've got now. So Gamaliel has Paul as his one student, and Paul becomes, in effect, the attorney general, to use our language. He's the chief prosecutor for the high priest and the chief priest. He's most likely to succeed. He's on the fast track. Paul comes from a mega wealthy family. They were not just Roman citizens, but they were citizens of Tarsus. Unlike today, if you're a citizen in Houston, Texas, a Texas resident and a U.S. citizen, your citizenship applies everywhere. Not so back then. A citizen of the Roman Empire meant you were a citizen of Rome itself. You were able to vote for the Roman Senate. You had all of the rights that attributed to the people who were citizens of Rome. To be a citizen of Tarsus, you had to be a citizen of that city, totally independent of any Roman citizenship. And to be a citizen of Tarsus, we know from Strabo, one of the writers at the time, required in essence a donation of 10,000 denarii to some big civic project. So for Paul to have been a citizen of Tarsus and a Roman citizen, he comes from a mega wealthy, mega endowed, mega placed family. He'll say he's a Pharisee of Pharisees, so we know that they were a devout family as well. He says he's a Hebrew of Hebrews in Philippians 4. It's 4 or 2. I know it's 4. Philippians 4, a Hebrew of Hebrews, which means that he's able to trace his lineage back through pre-Babylonian captivity. Oh. So he's the guy. He's got money. He's got a wife. He's on the Sanhedrin. He's the attorney general. He's on the fast track of success. The reason he's there when Stephen is stoned holding the cloak is because the way a stoning took place, they had to do it outside Jerusalem, but they had to keep it where the Sanhedrin, the ruling body, had a right to say if evidence came out at the last possible minute. Today, in the chambers that we have in America, there's a red phone. If there's a commutation of the sentence or the Supreme Court or the governor says stop, then there's got to be a phone right there. You cannot execute someone without a phone, a hotline, in case there's a last second salvo. The way they would do it in New Testament times is the Sanhedrin would be gathered together. The guy on the city wall would be able to see the Sanhedrin and would be able to see the place of crucifixion or stoning for Stephen. And so Paul is there, and Paul waves the cloak, which means, is it the all go? The guy on the wall waves the cloak, the Sanhedrin waves the cloak, comes back to the wall, goes back to Paul, and Paul waves the cloak. He's got the cloak that gives the death penalty to Stephen. So, I mean, and then he's got papers to go arrest people in Damascus, and that's when he's on the road. Now, you've got Paul on the road to Damascus. This guy's the guy. And boom, he does a 180. He is convinced that Jesus of Nazareth makes a physical appearance to him, blinds him. He goes into Damascus. He's preached to by Ananias, having already been told, go to Straight Street and find Ananias. And Paul has a radical conversion. He throws away everything he had. He's immediately on the run. He doesn't do it for the money. He doesn't do it for the prestige. He doesn't do it for any of those things at all. He gets stoned over and over. He gets whipped. He loses his marriage. He loses his place in society. He is a vagabond among vagabonds. He's having to make a living as a tent maker while he's on the road. And he's doing all of this and counting it as thrilling to do for the cause of Christ, including his Roman imprisonment.
But so, isn't that why we shouldn't trust Paul? You know, these people, they go whoa in one way, and then they go way in the other way. Those people are not, wouldn't you as a lawyer say, question his credibility as a witness?
No, I would say that we need to fairly assess whether he's credible, because you could be right. But the other side of the coin is, so we would believe that Paul had that experience and he was kind of like, nah, hey, what a day. Jesus appeared to me today. I was blinded. He got scales removed from my eyes, but I might change. I might not. Kind of makes me a middle of the road guy, straddle the fence. No, that's not Paul. I mean, and it wouldn't be anybody who experienced that. I dare say, Bill, if that were you, if tonight the Lord Jesus visits you, strikes you blind, and tells you, go find James Walker, have him pray over you, and you will be different, and it happens to you, I think next month's book club will be radically different. I don't think.
Well, of course, but back to the point, wouldn't you like to not only with Paul cross-examine these 500, but you know the zombies in Matthew 24, where the dead come out of Jerusalem, out of the graves, go to Jerusalem, and then they go, guys, I got to get back to the grave. I mean, we can't question any of these. Don't you find that troubling as a lawyer?
I'd love to question them. I got to tell you, so I tried a case 2 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri. In fact, I'll brag for a moment. It's the largest personal injury verdict that's ever been sustained by the U.S. Supreme Court in the history of the U.S. We won over $2.6 billion from Johnson & Johnson. And there were a number of witnesses, one of which was Bill Ashton, that I really wish I'd been able to put on the stand. I really wish I'd been able to question him. Problem is, he's dead. I can't question Bill Ashton. No, but I've got some of his papers, and I'm able to read those papers to the jury. I've handled countless asbestos cases where some of the key testimony and the key critical people lived in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They're long dead, but I've got the papers.
But you don't believe in Matthew 24, the zombies where they went to Jerusalem. Even Mike Licona doesn't believe that.
Well, I think it's Matthew 22, if I'm not
Whatever,
mistaken.
yeah. Well, they go to Jerusalem, and then they go back. We don't know where they are. We don't know who they are. Do you see why it bothers us?
Well, I mean, I can see why it would bother you. Sure, of course I can. Because that's the kind of thing, if you just read that, you might think, well, that's strange. Unless you're pretty steeped in Old Testament prophecy and the actual text of the Old Testament in its Hebrew and Aramaic originals. And then you'd realize that that's actually called for in the Old Testament as something that would happen on some kind of basis like that. And it's invoking an Old Testament prophecy more so than it's doing anything else at the time. It wasn't a Harry Potter moment. in the world. It was a fulfillment of prophecy. But go back to 1 Corinthians 15, where we started this. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul doesn't say some of whom are still alive. He says 500, most of whom are still alive. And he urges them to go talk to them. Now, you remember who Paul's traveling buddy was? Luke. Read the Gospel of Luke. Luke gives footnotes. He gives names. He gives identification so you can go talk to the people. He tells you it's the widow of, and he tells you where to go find her. And he tells you, and so he's giving explicit details of who these people are and say, go talk to them. But we don't have to look at just Paul. Every one of the apostles died a martyr's death.
We don't know that. That's just Christian propaganda. You have something in Polycarp and something in Clement, but again, that's hearsay. Am I not right?
Well, no, that would not be hearsay. That meets a hearsay objection. Exception. But if you go to Polycarp's another good example. So consider Polycarp. Here you've got a fella who is in Ephesus. Now, Polycarp was a student of the Apostle John. So that's what we were, one generation removed from the Apostle John with Polycarp. And we've got the death testimony of Polycarp. And Polycarp is refusing to deny the death and resurrection of Christ. He's refusing to deny the lordship of Christ. So here you've got this 80-plus-year-old man who's refusing to do it. And so the Roman powers that be send out the soldiers to try to find him. They get to a little town with a little village where they find a couple of guys who, after torture, say, okay, I'll tell you where he is. He's over there at this other house, because they're hiding him because he's the Christian giant that we've got left. He's the touch to the last generation. So the Roman soldiers go and they find him there. And beforehand, one of the narcs, one of the kids who sold him out, gets to the house first and says, get out of here. The Romans are coming. He says, I don't care. I don't need to run. And so now you've got this guy who doesn't run. The Roman soldiers come up and he says, yeah, I'll go with you. No problem. He says, can I eat first? And I'd really like to pray. They say, okay. So they let him eat and they let him pray. He's a kind, doddering old man. And then they take him to the Roman governor. The Roman governor says, man, I hate to put you to death. Just swear by the brilliance of Caesar and you'll be fine. And Polycarp's comment is, for 80 years, my Lord has stood by me and never betrayed me once. Why would I betray him? I'm not worried about dying. I got something much better than me. And so he goes in and they try to burn him, and then they try to kill. They kill him. Okay, and the whole time he's singing. And now, is that normal behavior? No, it's not. Why would somebody do that? And you say, yeah, but that guy who was that ethical, he was lying about how the other apostles died. He was lying. He made that stuff up. I mean, the guy's willing to give his life for what he believes, and you accuse him of being a liar on stuff that's totally, I mean, it'd be, what's wrong with saying, hey, he died of old age? There's nothing wrong with that. What does it behoove him to go to his grave lying if he's so deluded as to think that God's actually going to be there on the other side? It doesn't make sense. You have to work to disbelieve that kind of testimony. And it's why an earlier lawyer, Tertullian, said that the seed of the church has been the blood of the martyrs. The church has grown because of the martyrs. It's the fact that people will so readily give their life for this that's causing Christianity to grow out of control. I mean, do you realize the absurdity of the belief that you're espousing here? And I say that with affection. I don't mean it pejoratively, because I appreciate you and I appreciate your questions. I think they're very fair. But think about just so remove yourself from it. It's personal. Think about the absurdity of this. You've got a backwater armpit called Jerusalem in the Roman Empire. Doesn't merit diddly squat. Pilate gets sent there almost as a punishment. It's a Nothingsville. And then somewhere up in the mountains, north of there, you've got this real little armpit called Galilee. And there's a 30-year-old carpenter in Galilee from a nothing family with questionable heritage of his parents. And he preaches for 3 years, and then he's killed. And he's followed by a ragtag band of fisher people. He's got some fishermen and a couple of women who aren't even allowed to testify in court because they're women. And somehow that 3-year ministry produces something so massive that within 5 years, you've got thousands upon thousands of people who are believing that he is a resurrected Messiah. And it has grown to become the largest religion in the world and in history because of people who are convicted that this is true. That happens from some 30-year-old deadbeat carpenter with no life that lives for 3 years and then has a bunch of semi-literate fishermen as his ragtag band. And instead of going back to fishing, they start telling this lie that they saw a resurrected Jesus and claiming to do these miracles, and nobody's able to dispel it, and it doesn't just die away. I mean, that's pretty hard to believe.
Well, you've articulated, there is evidence. I tell my atheist brethren, there is evidence for Christianity, which you just articulated. It started in Jerusalem, where it could be easily falsified. Oh, by the way, Candida Moss wrote the Notre Dame, or Catholic scholar, wrote the book, The Myth of Persecution. So, but anyway, let me just wrap it up because there's a lot more questions. When you weigh the evidence for Christianity, even though there's evidence, there's so much, it's so contradictory, it's not contemporary, and it just, when you weigh the scales of evidence, Christianity does not add up. But let me go back to James. Thanks, Mark. I like your articulation.
Yeah, you need to read my first volume in this trilogy. So
we would love to read that at the book club. I was hoping you'd say
it's
that.
Called Christianity on Trial.
Well, I know that. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, Volume 1, Christianity on Trial. Volume 2, Atheism on Trial. Volume 3 just came out. I'll send you guys a complimentary copy.
Oh, thank you.
Religions on Trial. And where I look at various religious systems and try to find the truth in the systems, and also try to find areas where I challenge them.
Right.
But I will tell you this: I don't agree with you that Christianity that the weight is that way. If I thought it was, I would join you. I would be an atheist with you. Actually, I'd probably go Hindu. But
it's just not me, Mark. You have one of the top scholars in the world, Dale Allison, who says Jesus was wrong in his latest book. I asked him, you can look at the video, Road to Emmaus. Oh, that's not historical. You don't believe that, do you? Sea of Tiberias, or Fish Fry at the Sea of Tiberias. Oh, that didn't happen. Is there any history in the birth narratives? He goes, I do not see a lot of history in the birth narratives. Do you know Dale Allison?
No, I don't.
Oh my God, he just wrote the book Resurrecting Jesus, which he shows you that he was an apocalyptic figure who had a bad weekend in Jerusalem, and he just was wrong. And what we love about Dale Allison is he's honest and admits that the evidence just doesn't stack up, even though there's evidence for his resurrection.
I don't know him, but I can tell you that he teaches at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And I think
Princeton, I think.
Is he now at Princeton?
He's at both, I believe.
Okay. And I can tell you things about him, but he's not. Is he an atheist?
No, he's a Christian. That's what I'm saying.
So do you agree with him? Do you think he's right?
I love him because you have to. He lives with the tension. As a scholar, he goes, birth narratives of fiction. We all know that. Maybe some of these miracles didn't happen. The post-resurrection stories, which aren't in Mark has no post-resurrection stories, are all probably false. So you got to admire a guy like that.
He thinks Jesus rose from the dead, but in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, he's just wrong. Look, he's out there. He's not mainstream Christianity. And
you think so?
Yeah, I dare say so. And I'll tell you this. the oldest Christian writings we've got. Do you know what the oldest Christian writing we have is? Do you have got a clue?
Oh yeah, John 125, the 125 to 75 AD. Yeah.
No, well, that's the oldest manuscript copy we've got. The papyrus you're referencing.
The oldest complete manuscripts in the British Library. I visited it. It's 350 AD. That's 300 years after the fact.
That's Codex Sinaiticus, and I understand that as well. No, I'm talking about we have the oldest, the first written. Let's do it that way. Do you know what the first Christian writing was?
Was it not First Thessalonians?
Well, yeah. The first
Galatians, probably.
Or Thessalonians. It doesn't matter what.
Okay, so but if you look at Galatians or you look at Thessalonians, you're looking at something that was written probably within 10 years, 15 years of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, you go back and you look at that. You look at 1 Corinthians 15 that you were referencing before. You're still 60 AD at the latest for 1 Corinthians 13.
Oh, even more so. Bart Ehrman says it's a year after Jesus was crucified.
Yeah, look, Bart Ehrman's an interesting fella. Now, we can talk Bart till we're blue in the face, but I'm just telling you that there is a branch of people who ascribe to Christianity, who believe as Allison does, and I'm not denying that strain of academia fails to, but I'm just telling you, I think it would wither under cross-examination. I think it would. Now, am I a Christian scholar? Well, not per se, but the latest edition of the Greek New Testament, which was published by Tyndale House, you'll find in the credits me, because I was one of the Greek scholars who helped put it together from the original manuscripts that we've got and worked on it. I mean, this isn't something that I'm just some guy, hey.
I know.
Because, we're talking about things that are totally outside my book, but I think you'll hear from what I'm saying, I got a pretty good grasp of this stuff. And it's because I've spent my life trying to figure this out and study it. I've spent my life, I don't want to believe something that's fictitious. There is a social science concept that everyone who's anybody in the field will readily acknowledge exists. It's called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a shortcut that your brain takes, where your brain will filter arguments and evidence to find those that support what you already believe and glob onto them, and then just write off those you don't. So, for example, you'll read Allison or talk to Allison. You'll grab hold of those arguments he's got, which help support and reinforce your atheism. But the arguments that he's got that dispel your atheism, you discard those and you don't pay attention to those. That's confirmation bias. It is a limitation that all of us have to face. It's a limitation that's so prevalent that it's something I have to deal with every day in the courtrooms around America. And it's something that I would urge you to do a little research and look at, because I do think that it puts blinders on you and what you're willing to consider, because you'll cherry pick the things that support what you already believe and discard the things that don't.
But Mark, that's what we preach here is confirmation bias. It's Christian's middle name. We're post Bart Ehrman here. We've arrived to Dale Allison. That's the highest you can go. So I'll just quit because I take too long. But Ken Daniels turned me on to Dale Allison. He's actually read the 700-page book, Resurrecting Jesus. So I'll quit. Thank you very much.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for your answering the questions of Bill and sharing that. We've had off club. We've had long talks about these very same things, and Dale Allison has been one of our guest authors here at the club, as well as Bart Ehrman, and we got to ask those questions from both perspectives. What I wanted to talk to you about, we're going to in just a minute take questions from other club members, and so if you've got if you're a club member and you have a question or want to ask Mark a question, if you will put that into text, and then Daniel Ray and Brady Blevins will call you up at the right time and ask you to unmute. I know Ken has a question that'll be coming up here in a little bit. Let me ask you first before we go to the other club members, though. I was very interested, Mark, in your section on burden of proof, because this comes up a lot at the book club. There's in fact, going back, one of our guest authors, Christian guests, was Gary Habermas, and he was instrumental in dealing over many, many years with Antony Flew, who was one of the probably preeminent atheist philosophers, scholars of the latter part of the 20th century. Eventually, he became a deist and abandoned atheism. But Gary made this same point that Antony Flew kind of pioneered this idea of the atheist default position. In other words, you come into this, you should be thoroughly atheist, and then only if there's sufficient evidence of some types do you consider abandoning the atheism. And we hear this idea a lot of times that as atheists, we don't have a burden of proof, is what they'll say, because we're not making any positive affirmation. We're just saying we don't have enough evidence to believe in God, so we don't have to defend that in any way. In your book, you had this whole section, whole chapter on burden of proof. Could you explain and just kind of summarize why an atheist position is not a neutral position, but it is, you are making a positive affirmation and bear a burden of proof? Could you talk about that?
Well, it's rather arbitrary on who's got a burden of proof. I think if someone wants to assert something to be true, then arguably they have a burden to prove the truth of it. So if you want to assert that there is no God, then I would ask you, what's your proof? If you say, well, I don't have any proof, I just don't have any clue, so I've decided not, it's an open question. I'm not saying it's no, I'm saying I've decided the answer, three possible answers: yes, no, maybe. So I've decided the answer is no. And my comment is, well, wait a minute. How do you know it's no? Because if you don't have any ability to prove that, then the intellectually honest thing is to say, maybe. I don't know. Just say, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't have any proof, no. I don't have any proof, yes. So I don't know.
In recent years, that does seem to be a shift in that. You have more and more of a soft atheist approach, or I think it's even Richard Dawkins doesn't like to say there is no God. He likes to say now there probably is no God. The big advertising campaign the atheists had on the side of the buses there in the UK, there probably is no God. And so again, when I hear that kind of thing, then I want to quantify it. Well, is it 80%, 22%? What's the number that you're coming up with, and how did you arrive at that number? But it seems to me like if you're saying atheism is true, you're making an affirmation of some type, and I would think that a burden of proof would come with that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it does. Anytime you're asserting something to be true. So I've got an interesting past with this that I don't detail in the book. I'm a lawyer, but I'm active in certain circles. Our son, undergrad philosophy at the Ivy League school, Cornell. He then took a master's and a PhD in philosophy and logic at Oxford University, at the top college in the world on that, and then continued to teach logic there for several years, doing a postdoc at Hebrew University as well. And so I've spent 12, 15, 16 years now being at Oxford, more times than I can count, lecturing at Oxford, dealing with so many of the philosophers at Oxford, spent time at Cambridge, of course, as well, but not nearly as much as Oxford. And I know, I've seen these people, I've seen the arguments, I've talked to these people, I've talked to the arguments, I've seen the buses. The bottom line is that they've had to soften their position. Dawkins has had to say, probably, Dawkins is a decent scientist. No, Dawkins is a good scientist. Okay, he's a hack as a philosopher. I think most philosophy people in England would say that. But as far as a scientist, he's a good scientist. But he got into a lot of trouble because he was so assertive that there is no God. And then when pushed to it, he couldn't prove it. So through debates and other times, he finally got to a point where he realized the only intellectually honest thing he could say is there's probably no God. And so that shift has come about because nobody is able to prove there's no God. The atheist can't prove there's no God. There's no way to do it. And so what they've done now is they've shifted, and they'll say I'm an atheist, but they'll try to use an agnostic approach. So what I say in the book is, look, if you're an atheist and you say there's no God, prove it. And here are the proofs that are generally given, and they're rubbish. Now, if you're an agnostic and you're just saying, I don't know, that's fair. That's intellectually fair. And at that point, if I'm going to say, well, I do know, then I have the burden of proof, because I need to prove something that I'm asserting to be true. I'm not just saying, I don't know either. If I say I don't know either, then pay your money and you pick what you want. But if I'm going to say, no, I do believe this to be true, then I have a burden of proof. Now, what is the burden of proof? It's not a burden of proof that you would have on a chalkboard or a whiteboard with a mathematical equation, because we're not dealing with mathematics. It's not a burden of proof that you might have where you prove something through a logical progression, like you do in a logic class or a philosophy of logic class, because we don't have that. Instead, the burden of proof that I think is appropriate is the one we use in court all day, every day. I've got a case where I've represent, there used to be a drug called Vioxx, okay? Vioxx was like a super Advil or a super aspirin. It was a pain relieving drug made by Merck. It had a negative side effect. It would increase your chance of having a heart attack by over 600%. And the company never bothered to warn anybody about it. So I took the company to trial, and the very first Vioxx case, Carol Ernst versus Merck. It dealt with her husband, Bob Ernst. Bob had hand pain and was prescribed Vioxx, and he dies of a heart attack. Now, some people are one pork chop away from a heart attack already. That's not Bob. Bob was someone who was active. He ate well. He was not diabetic. He didn't have any of the risk factors other than the fact he was in his 60s for a heart attack. He ran races, 5Ks. He did bike races, triathlons, great shape, all the rest. I take it to trial, and I've got to prove some things. I've got to prove that the Vioxx more than likely caused his heart attack. But I also have to prove that he had a great love for his wife, and his wife loved him, and so she suffered as a result of his death. Now, I cannot prove that through a logical theorem. I can't prove that through a mathematical equation. I can't take a litmus paper that's really good for telling me if a liquid's an acid or a base, but I can't rub the litmus paper on his dead corpse to see whether or not he loved his wife. But I have to prove it. I can't just assume it. I have to prove it. And this is what courtrooms do all day long, that have made the courtrooms the best forum for determining truth. And it requires someone to be given instructions on what proof is of things that aren't subject to scientific inquiry. And the proof is you put the evidence in the scales. You assess how much you want to value the evidence, because like Bill said, anytime you've got a Christian writing about Christ, you got to take that into account because there's some bias there. Okay, so you take all of that stuff into account. You decide how much credibility to give the evidence, but then after you decide it, you decide what's more likely than not. That's the preponderance of the evidence by a legal standard. And that kind of proof, I have driven companies into bankruptcy with that kind of proof. I've had Johnson & Johnson have to pull their talc powders off the shelves all around the world to get the asbestos out of there because of that kind of proof. 2 years from now, if we have this discussion again, I'll bet you Tylenol will have a warning on its label because I'm leading the charge right now against the manufacturers of Tylenol. Because if you take Tylenol as a pregnant woman, it increases the chance your child's going to be born with autism by over 160%. And they won't warn pregnant women about that. But we do that stuff. We change behaviors. We change by that burden of proof. And that's the burden of proof that should be there when we're deciding these issues. Is there a God or not?
Appreciate that, Mark. I've got some other questions, but I want to. We're already kind of late into the club, and I want to give other people some chances. Maybe I can circle around back to mine if the opportunity comes back open again. So, Daniel or Brady, do we have some any questions queued up? Or?
Yes, we have Ken Daniels, and James. Ken is going to want to share his screen. So I'm not sure if he can just do that, or if you're going to need to give him permission to do that.
I made him temporary co-host.
Good
So
deal.
you should be able to see a button there, Ken, when it's your turn to share that screen with us.
All right, Ken, you're up, buddy.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate you, doctor. Are you doctor? I don't know. I want to say doctor if you're a doctor, but I don't want to say doctor if you're not. So
look, I've got a doctorate degree. I've got 4 if you count 3 honorary doctorates, but
okay.
Only 1 earned. But I don't go by that. I'm Mark. I'm just
okay. Well, thank you, Mark, for being here. It's a treat. It's a privilege to have you. We've had a lot of luminaries on the show and on this forum, and you're one of them. So appreciate you being here. Now, I don't claim to be anywhere near the level of you in any regard, whether it's biblical languages or law or anything of that nature. I was a Wycliffe Bible translator for a number of years in Africa. But contrary to common perception, most Bible translators in Wycliffe don't, at least not initially, don't have to get biblical languages training. That can come along the way if needed, but typically there's a lot of Bible translators don't even have that. So, and I'm one of them. I had a little bit of Greek and Hebrew.
That's changing a bit.
Okay, all right, cool. Well, that's probably a good thing. But anyway, so I did leave the faith back in 2000, so about 22 years ago. First, it was things that I saw in the Bible that gave me pause, that made me wonder if this was really divine origin or whether it was just human origin. And I came to way on the latter that it was probably of human origin, but that's not what I wanted to get into. So later on, I evolved more into deism. I was a deist for a while, and then I slid into agnosticism. I currently call myself an atheist leaning agnostic. So that's kind of the label I prefer. So I don't pretend to know that there's no God, or even I'm not strong against the idea that there's no God. I just happen to think on balance it's less likely than not that there's a God. But I did find your approach very interesting, where you laid out, okay, here's on this column, and here's atheism, and on this column there's Christianity. You've got all these different phenomena that we observe, and then you kind of tick off the correct box. I had taken that approach myself earlier, and I'd shared that verbally with some of the members of the club in the past. Kind of a Bayesian way of looking at things, like if given a certain situation that we see, or a given phenomenon that we see, is it necessary under atheism or naturalism? Is it expected? Is it likely? Is it merely compatible, or is it contrary? The same question for theism. So you take theism and naturalism, and so I have this little chart that I came up with. It's a little bit similar to yours, but it's just an illustration how you can, if you're coming from a different angle, you approach it completely differently. You get different results. So I just wanted to share my screen on that. So if we have, let's say we have a given that we're all here, we're sentient beings, we can reflect on our existence, and we can discuss our ideas with others. I'm not exploring how we got here, I'm just assuming that we're here. We observe things. We observe that the universe is very, very old. So under naturalism, you would say, well, that's required. If it was young, there wouldn't have been time for evolution or anything to get us off the ground, right? Under theism, you say, yeah, either way. You say, could be old, could be young. This is just generic theism. I'm not getting into biblical theism or anything. I'm just saying, under theism, you could look at it either way. It could work either way. So this is not an argument against, I want to be very clear, this is not an argument against theism, because it could go either way, right? Same with large universe. I think it's required because not only do you need lots of time, but you need lots of space for life to get started and evolve and something to happen for us to be here. So I think it's required under naturalism, whereas it's merely compatible with theism. Again, not an argument against theism, but it's compatible with theism, whereas it's required with naturalism. Same thing for biological evolution. If we observe biological evolution that has happened, that is something that would have been required for us to be here. Whereas under theism, it could have been special creation, or it could have been, guided or unguided evolution either way.
Watch out, Ken. He's taking notes. You're in trouble, baby.
So I'm just going down the line. So even the existence of animals, something as mundane as the existence of animals, right? Think about it. Under naturalism, the animals have to be there because they have to be a bridge between lower forms of life and us, right? If there were no animals or no record of animals in the fossil record, naturalism would be dead on arrival. Whereas with theism, yeah, you might expect it, it's compatible. You don't know one way or the other up front. I'm talking about generic theism here. Up front, you can't make a justification because God is God. I mean, you express that in your book. He says we can't impose our views of God. God is going to be who God is, right? So if God is who God is, we can't have any prior expectations of who God should be. So that's why I think all of these pretty much are compatible. The only one I accepted here is the near universality of certain moral views would be expected under theism and perhaps compatible with naturalism. Whereas cultural evolution and diversity, well, let me go back to this one, this morality. I remember, observing, dogs fighting over a bone or over a mate or whatever. And I remember as a teenager thinking, animals have some of the same emotions and conflicts and things that we have. And if we evolved from animals, these types of emotions and kind of an underlying sense of morality have existed forever. It comes free with evolution. It doesn't require a story of a talking snake in a garden and people make, primeval couple making a choice. If you already accept evolution, these are there for free. This is more parsimonious. So you would expect that under naturalism, but it's merely compatible with theism. So, I mean, I won't go through all of these, but I'm just, make a list and just, you can add, I've been selective. You would add different things and you would come to different conclusions. But this is the way I look at it. And if you have questions about, particular items here, I'd be glad to, take your question on that.
I've got a couple other questions I'd like to ask you first. Tell me your background. Who are you? What do you do for a living?
So I'm married. I have 3 kids. They're adults now. And again, I was with Wycliffe. I grew up in Africa myself. My parents were missionaries with the SIM in Ethiopia, Liberia, and Nigeria, and mostly Bible church, Baptist churches that they attended. And I grew up in that as well. Gave my life to Jesus when I was 4, and rededicated my life when I was in 8th grade, and went to the mission field. Married an evangelical wife. Went to the mission field joined Wycliffe in 92. Went overseas to Africa. Then on the field is where I was reading the Bible and basically gave up on the Christian faith as a result of that. And I would have told you at the time I had a very strong relationship with God, through Jesus, and that I trusted in Him to take away my sins. So I was very evangelical, but I just had an intellectual crisis of faith. The more I dug into the Bible, especially, again, it wasn't theism versus naturalism at the time that took me away from the faith. It was more the problems that I saw in the Bible.
Interesting.
And I'm a computer science. I'm a major in computer science, but I also did, seminary at Columbia Bible College and Seminary in South Carolina as well. So that's about it.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's real helpful. Is what does your wife think of your faith journey?
Well, she's not on board with where I've gone. She's still a Christian. I go to church with her, maybe once a month. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's see if I have an ability to share my screen.
Sure.
How would I? Will you guys allow me to share my screen? Let's see. Host has disabled screen sharing.
Oh, one thing that I wanted to follow up on that, even though I said on the right-hand column, if it says merely compatible, and on the left-hand side, it said required, that wasn't evidence against Christianity. When you have two opposing points of view under Bayesian theory, and they're mutually exclusive, theism and non-theism, then if you have enough items that line up under required in one and compatible in the other, then you start to form evidence in favor of the one that says required, and by default becomes evidence against the one that doesn't acquire those attributes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Bayesian thought and analysis, and so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Hey, Mark, I just made you co-host, so you can share your screen when you want to.
So, are you able to see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I've done is I've taken what you had, and I've tried to put it onto just a PowerPoint slide because that's the easiest way I can think of to handle it. And what I've done is instead of theism versus naturalism, I've put Christianity up there, because anytime you just say theism, by definition, you have expanded the pool from a Christian perspective into areas that frankly may not be that true. And if you're going to do a true Bayesian analysis here that you're going to use for proof purposes, I think instead of something with theism, which has inherently contradictory views within it, it might be more useful to focus on Christianity, at least the Christianity I believe in, because that's what, from a Bayesian analysis, I would want to see as the comparison. So an old universe, I would agree with you that it's compatible. Let's take that out of bold to make it continue to make sense. So I would put compatible with that. And I say that recognizing that, I could make an argument that it's expected. And that's the argument of, did Adam have a navel? If God, it doesn't say that God created a universe to go kabang. And it says that God created the heavens and the earth. And so within a framework of that, it gives the sense that God would have created something that, like trees, that if you look at a tree, you say, well, gee, that's one day old. Was Adam an infant? Was it egg and sperm unite? No. He was created as a adult of sorts, someone of age, maybe is a better way to say it. So I could make an argument, but let's just say compatible. Large universe. I think that's expected because the whole Christian concept is that the heavens declare the wonders and the glories of God. You read Psalm 8 that speak about such things. When I behold the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you've appointed, what's man that you're mindful of them? I mean, the grandioseness of the heavens, speak to the grandioseness of God. If you remember, Hebrew has maybe 6,000 active vocabulary words in biblical times. We've got the average English speaker who's got a high school degree, speaks about 25,000 words, but has a functioning vocabulary of 50,000 words. That means you got roughly a 9 to 10 to 1 ratio, where those Hebrew words have to account for like 9 or 10 of ours. Made you a job as a Wycliffe Bible translator tougher, but it's the way of it. And so fingers, for example, aren't so much a reference to anatomical digits when it talks about the work of God's fingers. Fingers are also, that word references fine detailed work. And so that God did fine detailed work in this massive universe. That only makes sense if the universe is massive. Biological evolution.
I think maybe I want to go back to that for a second. I think most people thought the universe was was impressively large as they looked up to the stars. I don't know. I'm not an ancient, so I don't know what I would have thought if I just looked up. I probably would have thought, "Wow, that's immense." But I don't think that anybody had any clue that it was nearly as big as we now know it to be. But the thing is that you can see some creationist literature that talks about like how the privileged planet, how the Earth is just the right distance from it, the sun, the right angle, the right yada yada, the oxygen, what all these things that are enumerated. Well, those arguments, yes, they're impressive, but they tend to evaporate in the light of just the extreme immensity that the trillions of galaxies and trillions of stars within each galaxy. Just you couldn't have an ideal incubating environment like the Earth if you didn't have a universe that size. Whereas God could have created the Earth, the universe, to be as large as people perceived it to be with the human eye. They had no telescopes back then. I don't think the Bible indicates anything beyond what was evident to the human eye. So I don't know that it was expected.
Yeah, I would say that the Bible is a pretty profound book as a revelation of God, and that we can look at it within its time of being written, and that's important context to understand it. But we also need to recognize that God wrote it in such a way that here we are, thousands of years later for some of the texts, and still able to find it useful and fruitful and instructive. Yeah, no, I think that God, I would expect a large universe. And one of the notes that I wrote while you were talking when Bill called me out is right here. It's interesting to me that you use value words like old universe and large,
relative to what was thought earlier by most humanity.
Yeah, because the large universe, it's large compared to what they thought 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect it will be even larger within 10 years after they've had more time with our marvelous new telescope that's up there. Okay.
Yeah, I don't agree with the expected there, but I'll give that for the sake of argument. Even if I give that to you, it still is trumped by the required under naturalism. So I mean, just the wording of it. That's
okay. I won't fuss that with you. Biological evolution, compatible, certainly. If you read Simon Conway Morris, are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
Okay, Simon Conway Morris is he's probably the world's greatest cited scientist on evolution. He's number one or number two if you do a Google search. You go back to like Allison, and I haven't done a Google search on Allison to see how many that Bill was talking about, how many people cite him in academia as an authority. But I can tell you, Simon Conway Morris wrote the book on the Burgess Shale, which is the Bible, if you will, on evolution. He is probably, if not number one, number two, most cited evolutionists in the world. He's at Cambridge University, absolutely brilliant fellow who believes, devoutly believes in the virgin birth, the physical death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He is as orthodox in his Christian faith as anybody you'll ever find. And he argues that evolution should be expected by any Christian, because even within the text of the Bible, where God says to be fruitful and multiply, the concept is that God has created us where we're able to thrive and change and adapt to different environments. And if evolution ultimately is those species that are most suited for an environment are the ones that thrive, he argues that that's expected. I put a question mark next to it because I might think that it's more compatible. But again, I won't fuss with you that it's required under naturalism.
And I meant to lead by giving you a big, huge kudos, because this group, the Christian side of the group, is largely conservative and would be opposed to evolution. So I applaud anybody who comes in here and tries to move the needle a little bit in the direction of demonstrable scientific findings,
Well,
which I included evolution.
The woman who does the upkeep on our internet website for the Sunday school class that I teach, who also now works at my library, is a research scientist at Rice University, one of the top 10 schools in the United States. And her area is evolutionary biology. And she is, I mean, you'll find her on National Geographic specials. She's an evolutionist extraordinaire, who's also a very devout Christian and believer in all sorts of miracles and the movement of the Holy Spirit, all sorts of things. Now, I don't want to we'd spend the whole night going through all of this. But what I'd like to do instead is I'd like to say animals, I mean, heavens, animals are taught. That is required for the Christian narrative to be true. Animals suffering over eons.
Well, I mean, I don't think you're maybe following kind of what I was getting at with animals. Like, well, I guess, yes, under theism, Christianity, well, the Bible is based on, people wrote the Bible, right? And they could see that there's animals. Obviously, there's animals. This kind of an a priori argument versus an
no, not at all, not at all, because the biblical teaching is that God made the animals for an important purpose, to function within the universe itself. So the Christianity argument is that, I mean, we need foodstuffs. You know, God could have made humanity where they didn't need to eat.
Right.
But humanity eats. Yeah, humanity eats. So it is required under the Christian concept of who we are that we have plants that are edible, that we have sources of protein, not just soybeans, but protein 12 months out of the year, animal life, things like that.
But to cut to the chase on that, the authors of the Bible had access to the physical world in which they saw animals, and they ate animals, and so those were woven into the scriptural narrative. There was nothing prescient or necessary about that. But there is something necessary about animals existing under naturalism.
Well, I would say that it's required under Christianity. I mean, yeah, you can always say, well, they wrote that later. Okay, they wrote it later, but that doesn't mean that it's not required with the worldview. We're looking here at Christianity as a worldview. You cannot have a Christian
which takes the visible world into consideration.
Exactly.
I'm just saying it could have been otherwise. Under theism, any of these things could have been otherwise, right? Because God could have made any world that he or she wanted to.
Yeah, well, but my whole point is a Christian worldview requires animals. A Christian worldview requires suffering, depending on how you define suffering, and that would take a lot of time. A Christian worldview requires human bodies. That's the whole point. Is that I
think that both the Christian worldview and an atheist worldview attempts to take the data that we observe and make sure their worldview fits.
As I was reading the book, it was like, a lot of these things were being fit into a paradigm to make it appear that these were, Christianity was trumping naturalism. But I'm just saying that you can lay it out in such a way that it, it's convincing on the other side as well. Animal suffering. What's the necessity of animal suffering prior to the existence of humans? I assume you believe that animals died of parasitism and hunger and disease and fire and all the ravages that nature could throw at them for hundreds of millions of years, sentient beings prior to the advent of humanity. I don't find anything necessary about that, given a God who could create with the snap of his fingers humanity fully developed.
You ever kill a mosquito?
Sure.
Are you a vegan?
No, I cut back on meat, but I'm a reducetarian. Yeah.
So you are someone who produces animal suffering.
Yeah. You are
true.
An animal. I'm trying to wean myself from it. I'm on a journey right now.
Badgering the witness, Your Honor.
Yeah. You're an animal persecutor. Yeah. Okay, fine. Well, I think it depends on how you define suffering. That's why I put suffering in quotation marks. I will tell you that the rest of these are required. Sex is required. Parasitism, that's
No,
compatible.
I mean, angels don't, have sex.
Yeah, angels aren't humans.
Right.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, it gets back into the whole thing about when we got into the animals. I think it's not a small point that I'm trying to make, that obviously sex exists, obviously animals exist. These are things that everybody sees and knows and can weave into any narrative, whether it's Muslim or Hindu or whatever theistic narrative it is. I don't find that to be anything other than just pure observation.
By the way, Mark, John Loftus, who's been on our program, just wrote a book, God and Horrendous Suffering, which makes Ken's point. Could we do? I know we want to move on. Could we do divine hiddenness?
Okay, time.
Is that
time
required?
Out.
Divine hiddenness?
No, time out though. 1 second, Ken. You've done something that's fundamentally, I think, unfair intellectually, and I want to challenge you on it. You're saying that the Bible was written in essence post hoc, that it's written to fill in this narrative so that these things are required or expected. And I would suggest to you that the 60 some odd books of the Bible that have been written by unknown numbers of authors over thousands of years were never really written to compare naturalism to Christianity or theism.
I'll give you that.
And so to say that, yeah, but it was written that way so that it would take this into account, I don't think that they ever even remotely registered the debate that you and I are having on this, such that it would have tainted what they wrote because they were trying to get through it. I do like what Bill said, though, about looking at some of these things, because another one of the notes that I wrote on my twisted little paper is that you're missing a whole lot of things on your chart.
Sure, I just ripped this up today, so yeah, I mean, you can add a lot.
Yeah, so you're missing a lot of things that are required with Christianity that are not expected with naturalism. And how you can say, so the Bayesian computation is boom, 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 when you have left out and cherry picked what you've put on here, which I would debate the way you've put it on here clearly, but you've left out things that naturalism should never expect, not expected. The only thing you put down is supernatural, but you left out half the stuff from my book. I mean, where does naturalism expect that justice is viewed? Well, let's take a step back. Where does naturalism expect consciousness?
Okay, so that was where I started with I gave myself a cheat at the top. I gave myself a given that, and if you go all the way to the top, I don't know if you have access to that, but my thing at the top says, given sentient social beings that exist that can reflect on their existence and discuss their ideas with others. We wouldn't be having this discussion if that weren't a given, right? So all right, I agree. That opens up a whole nother topic of like, why are we here? How do we get here? All those things. Yes, I agree with you. But I put that in as a given. So
well, that's like me putting in as a given a whole bunch of stuff that I don't want you to weigh. I mean, you can't do that. That's one of the most fundamental critical questions, and naturalism doesn't have an answer. You can read David Chalmers, who is the world's leading. He's not a theist to my knowledge. I should ask him. He's at NYU. I lectured at NYU yesterday. He's not a theist to my knowledge. I'll ask him sometime maybe. But David Chalmers, the world-renowned authority on philosophical approaches to consciousness, will tell you it's not expected.
Right. It's just that we wouldn't be having this conversation if we didn't have.
But that's my whole point, Ken. It's expected under Christianity. It's not expected under naturalism. Why is that not in your scales?
Well, that's why. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions in our group about those things, about like origins and fine tuning and consciousness and things like that. I didn't.
So why is it not in your scales?
We could add it to our scales for sure. I just started with a premise that we're already here. That's why I started with a given, because I sense that the focus of your book was not about all those things. It was more about like what we're living, what we observe, how the things that we observe in our
But
daily
there's
life.
nothing more fundamental than observing
Right,
consciousness.
right.
Go get
It's
to
not something it's not something I think you may have brought it up in the book. It wasn't something you emphasized, to my knowledge, strongly. But yeah, we can add that in there for sure.
Because I didn't bring up a lot of this stuff that you've got in here.
Right.
It's not in my book. But I'm just telling you, consciousness itself is not expected under naturalism. True?
That is true. But we wouldn't
And
have
yet,
this
with
conversation
Christianity,
without
it's required. True?
right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you and I have it, right?
Right.
So wouldn't you say in your scales of your Bayesian analysis here that we've got something that's not expected with naturalism, which is clearly present and is required by Christianity? And you got to give me an explanation for that one, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably tend towards the anthropological principle. What is that principle where, we're not on an Earth, we don't live on a planet that doesn't have the right attributes for life, because if we wouldn't be there if we didn't have the right attributes for life. In other words, so it's a matter of like this vastness of the universe and the vastness of time, and perhaps multiverse. I don't know. I don't have an explanation for it. To me, it's an unknown. That's why I'm an agnostic and not an atheist. Okay,
but if you're going to use your Bayesian approach for proof,
right.
If you're going to use your Bayesian approach, man, I mean, your Bayesian approach all of a sudden is saying, okay, if I got a choice here between naturalism and Christianity, and something that I know is there is not expected with naturalism, and I can't explain it with naturalism. I just can't. But it's required by Christianity, and it's there. It's the thing you can't deny.
Well, couldn't you even argue that the whole periodic table would not be expected under naturalism?
Well, I mean, we could get into
you get hydrogen and helium at best.
We could get into a whole host of things about origins. I'm just talking about, given the fact that we're here, we find ourselves awake and alive on this planet, and then we see things that line up with what we would expect if we were here. And setting aside that, I agree. I'm not trying to be dishonest here. I'm not trying to be equivocating here. I set up the given on purpose so to avoid that discussion, but I do grant you that it is a problem for atheism.
What occurs to me, Ken,
I'm not trying to avoid that.
Yeah, what occurs to me though is what you've done is in effect me saying, I'm going to try to figure out whether or not my birth parents, my mom and dad, ever copulated, ever had sex. Okay, I'm gonna try to figure that out. Now my dad's dead, so I can't ask my dad. What am I going to do? Well, I got news for you. I can just take for granted that I'm here, but the fact that I'm here and 62 years old is a pretty good indicator that about 62 years and 9 months ago, a sperm entered an ovum, and boom, here comes a new human being. I mean, if you're conscious and you're sitting here and you're saying, man, I can't explain why I'm conscious because my worldview says I should not be conscious, but I am conscious and I like my worldview, so I'm still going to embrace it. Then what you have just done is accepted a worldview that's contradicted by your life experience. And instead of chasing down the answer, you put it on a shelf and said, well, I'm just not going to answer that. And I would urge you to consider answering it.
I think there's a lot of questions that in the past have not been answerable. Like nobody knew, for example, how the Earth was suspended in space. They thought it was sitting on pillars or turtles or whatever. It was just inconceivable how the Earth could be supported. We now know because we have we have hindsight. We have science that has told us that there's gravity and the Earth revolves around the sun. But there was a time when speculating about how the Earth sits on it. Somebody had said, "Oh, well, you got to explain how the Earth is not falling down. How we're not just falling somewhere. It's got to be supported by something." If the elders had told a young whippersnapper, "Hey, you got to have an explanation for this, and you got to subscribe to our explanation. There's turtles or there's pillars or whatever," then that would have been premature, because the better answer is just say, I don't know. If you really don't know, better answer is, I don't know, not saying, some magical being put it into place.
Yeah, well, I think that's a cop out. In all candor, I think that's a cop out. I mean, we know quite a lot right now. We've got functional MRIs that know quite a bit. I'd urge you to read Sharon Dirick's book, Am I Just My Brain? It's a good introductory level book on this issue of consciousness.
I've listened to a couple debates with her on the Unbelievable podcast. So
Okay.
Yeah, she's pretty good.
Yeah, she's got her PhD from Cambridge in brain imaging.
Right,
And
right.
she's a dear friend, a wonderful lady. She lives in Oxford, and I'd be glad to introduce you to her sometime. This is not something that I think you should just punt and say, well, we're not smart enough to know, so I'm going to assume later on someone's going to figure out how this is compatible with my worldview, when it seems entirely incompatible with my worldview and compatible with a worldview that I've written off.
The point I was trying to make by having the given and setting up the way I did is, yes, I should have set it up this way by saying, yes, I understand there's a lot of problems to solve about a naturalistic origin of how we got here to begin with. But for the purpose of this discussion, and it looks like self-serving, I'll grant you that it was self-serving, but it's a good thought experiment to say, even though I don't quite understand how I got here, and even though it looks completely improbable, everything else lines up with the idea that what you would expect if there wasn't a God, or most all of the other things line up. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. Not that I have an answer for those things, or that I was trying to avoid it. It's just that it's like if there is a God, why did God set it up in such a way that it looks like it would be as if we had arrived here through naturalistic processes?
Oh, but I've got a great answer for that. I think there's a solid Christian answer for that. God made this world in a way that makes sense. God made this world where it would have a history. God made us where we've got an ability to go dissect DNA. And we need to be able to do that, to be able to combat disease, to be able to combat misery, to be able to fight the effects of this fallen world that are miserable and terrible. And I think we have a responsibility to do that. I think it's laid out in the very beginning in the story of Adam and Eve. Adam is told in Hebrew, the English translations say that he is to work and to keep the garden and the earth. The word work is eved in Hebrew, and it means to tend to the plants. It's used for snipping grapevines and pruning grapevines. It's used for gardening. That's working the garden. But the word that's translated oftentimes keep is the Hebrew word shamar. And if you did take any Hebrew at all, it was probably your paradigm verb, shamarti, shamarta, shamart, shamra, as you remember that perhaps from first year Hebrew. But shamar is not just to keep. Shamar also means to guard, but it also means to look at and try and discern whether or not it's good or bad or what it is. And that's the word, for example, that Isaiah uses for a watchman on the watchtower who's looking out, trying to assess things. The responsibility of Adam from the very beginning is to figure out this world, figure out how it works, because he needs to take what he can figure out, the scientific method, I would say, and use it to try to come to good ends at the end of the day. And I think that there's a reason Newton and others were Bible-believing Christians as they tried to explore the sciences, because they recognized that God did not make a Harry Potter world of incantations and spells. God made a world, as Paul says in Romans 1, that whose very nature reflects the character of God and the invisible qualities of God. And God is he's a cause and effect God. He's a just God. He's a consistent God. And so you would expect the sun is going to rise from the east every day, not just a few days of the week. It is a world that that does make sense, not just in the here and now, but historically. So we would expect the world, if you had cut down a tree, if God did create trees, boom, and evolution is not the answer. If God just made a tree, don't you suspect you could cut the tree down and count the rings and say, oh, this tree's 30 years old? Well, yeah, but God just made it. But he made it as a real tree. So it might have rings that reflect it's 30 years old. And those rings, knowing God's a consistent God, if some of those rings are fat to show that it was a year of a lot of rain and growth, and some are thin to show it was a year of very little rain and very little growth, I'll bet if you cut the tree down next to it, you'd find they were consistent and told a consistent history. So
it sounds a little bit deistic, what you're describing, and I probably could have made a better case here if I had scrapped naturalism and said deism instead. Then we wouldn't have gotten into the argument about like consciousness and the origins.
Yeah. If you'll get a God in there, it'll help you a whole lot.
Right, but it's indistinguishable from there. Not once things are there, whether it's deism or naturalism. Once it's all in place, then it's indistinguishable from naturalism.
Well, no, it's.
Hey guys, let me break in just a minute. Great conversation, discussion that you guys are having on both sides. Fascinating. I do want to get an opportunity to have some other people come in and interact, ask some questions.
I apologize.
No. It was great. But a quick question before we go to the next person. If you could stop sharing your screen, that'll help too, Mark. So we can perfect. So we can see a bit better. The Lanier Theological Library. Okay, is this like a museum? Is this something that you can go to? Is this something that a wing of your house has been dedicated to, or where is this thing?
So it's in Houston, Texas. We originally lived on about 40 acres. We carved 10 acres out and put it into a foundation. We built about a 20,000 square foot library that's got about 110,000 volumes to it. We open it up to anybody who wants to use it. It's not a circulating library where you check books out. It's a reference library where you work within the library itself. It's open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. It stays open late on Tuesday night. It's part of a larger village that we've created. We've got a learning center that's just being finished right now. We've got several universities that offer courses there. We teach 2 Greek classes, first-year Greek and second-year Greek there on a weekly basis. Everything is free. Everything is open. We've got not just the volumes in Christianity. We've got massive volumes in Judaism, in history, in ancient Near Eastern studies, in archaeology, in classics, in philosophy and logic, Greek and Latin studies, Egyptology, church history in particular. Those are the areas where we're pretty exhaustive in what we've got. Now, we do have a few museum-y type things that I consider bait, B-A-I-T, to help high school kids and others want to come in or make a field trip so they can find out books aren't simply on a computer and you can learn something without having to Zoom or YouTube it or Insta to whatever it. And so we've got a little bit of bait to bring people in. And we've got some pretty cool bait, I should add. But
so if Bill Cluck and I took a road trip with maybe some of the other club members that wanted to come down there, you give us a personal little tour and show us around, right?
Heartbeat, a personal tour. I'll serve you food and set you up for yet another grand meeting. I'll bring in Janet Seifert, who is our evolutionary biologist, who's on staff with her PhD from Rice University, and let her explain to you science from an evolutionary perspective. I'll bring in, absolutely, in a heartbeat. I'll bring in David Capes, who's our head librarian, but also was the dean of theological studies at Wheaton before that, and let him give you some challenging ideas that maybe Allison wouldn't agree with, but are certainly in academia, as he's one of the top. He's translated the Bible. And I'm glad, Bill, you that Dallas Cowboy shirt, that Dallas Cowboy jersey had to go, brother.
You guys won the World Series. We're nothing. We always lose first round of the playoffs. But I would love that party.
All right,
down in Houston.
Well, let's get a group together. We'll take a trip down there. I would enjoy that. So
I'd love it.
Hey, Daniel or Brady, do we have somebody else queued up?
Yeah, the Cowboys thing was the only thing Bill's gotten right. But anyway, Dan has
Yeah.
Dan has something that he wants to bring up. Dan, it's you, Bubba.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for being on. And I was the one that was emailing you recently about our podcast. So I just to put a name to a face. I recently, last year, had quite a back and forth on social media with a very popular atheist argument. Your book, your chapter on the invisible God reminded me of this whole thing, and I thought I'd ask you what your thoughts on it are. I don't know if you've ever heard of the argument from Divine Hiddenness from J.L. Schellenberg.
Yeah, remind me what it is.
Okay, so Schellenberg's premise is basically God is, if there's a loving God, he's always open to a personal relationship with people. And the flip side of that, the second premise is basically, or the third premise is basically that there are non-resistant non-believers. So he's making two premises. A loving God, if he exists, he's always open to a relationship. And there are, how does he put it? Non-resistant non-believers. In other words, he's making the assumption that there are people that are open to a relationship with God, but don't believe in God. Yeah. And so his conclusion is if there's a loving God out there, and he's always open to a relationship with somebody, but there are non-resisting non-believers out there, then God, this loving God doesn't exist because these people aren't Christians. And I wonder what you think of that basic. I didn't know how familiar you were with it, or
I'm familiar with it.
And then what do you think?
Okay, so here's where I may upset my evangelical brethren on this call. I think that God is in the saving business. I think that God is looking for any way he can to bring anybody into a relationship with him. I think that God makes his judgments on us based not necessarily on how much we know, but based upon whether or not we're seeking him in whichever degree we have an understanding of him. So the classic example from Schellenberg is what about, the poor people in Africa, the tribesmen that Ken had not yet translated the Bible for, that don't have any knowledge or any scripture or anything like that. And yet we know that those of you who are atheists are in a minority in this world, that in almost every culture, around, 85 to 90% of humanity believes there's a God. There's just a fuss over who he, she, or it is, or they. And so recognizing that most people have some sense of the divine, I think even if they don't understand how God saves them through the blood of Christ, that he still saves them through the blood of Christ. I would go so far, and here's where I had a big fight with William Lane Craig, and I think he's heretical on this issue. I just flat disagree with him on this. I think he's so dead wrong. I said to him, do you believe that an infant who dies is going to heaven? Well, of course he does. And I said, and yet we know that the infant is a fallen human. The reason the infant goes to heaven is because Christ has paid the price for that infant's sin. Even though the infant has no knowledge of it, doesn't know about it, it's still been paid because Christ paid the price for all sin. And whoever it is, and God's out there trying to reel everybody in. I mean, God's still speaking to Bill. He's still speaking to Ken, in my opinion.
Well, wait a minute. I'm a Calvinist follower, and if you believe in the irresistible grace, this has nothing to do with you. If God wants you, he's going to get you. And Esau and Jacob, before they were even born, hey, Esau, I hate you, Jacob, I love you. What do you think of Calvinism?
Hey, Ken is the very rare Calvinist atheist.
That's pretty rare to be a Calvinistic atheist.
I was just kidding. So
yeah, I think John Calvin's rolling over there in Geneva or wherever they're
Probably.
I'm not a Calvinist, though I do think that there's a lot of truth. I'm not a 5-point Calvinist. Let me put it that way. And I don't believe irresistible grace is it. But to the extent it is, it doesn't matter because it's all a question of how you're defining those terms. I'm just going to tell you that I think that an infant who dies, or a 3-year-old, I got a 3-year-old grandson who's a sinner through and through, who doesn't understand that Jesus died for him. But I got to tell you, if he died tonight, and God may that not be, because my daughter wouldn't live through it, neither would the rest of us. But if something were to happen to him tonight, I have no doubt he would be in the arms of Jesus. And so I think that it's a bad premise. You've set up a straw man. Schellenberg set up a straw man to say that you can have a loving God who wants a relationship, and then you can have these people he's going to send to hell. By the way, I'm also an annihilationist, so I'll let you know where I land on that too. Because I do think that God winds up just extinguishing these people. That's the ultimate capital punishment, eternal damnation. You're dead forever. I don't.
You're my kind of Christian. You believe in evolution and you believe in annihilationism.
Yeah,
so we're welcome back. You're welcome to come back anytime.
And you're welcome to come to my class anytime because you'll hear me teaching it to a bunch of Southern Baptists and others who show up.
Get kicked. I'm surprised they don't kick you out.
No, I've converted our preacher too. It's
spreading like a cancer.
By the way, Mark, I come to Houston. I'd love to come to your house or your class and have a discussion, atheist, Christian, something to that sort of thing. I would love that. I think it'd be real informative.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, the P in Calvinism, perseverance of the saints.
Yeah.
What they would say is Ken was never a Christian. And with me, that's okay. I never really achieved much as a Christian. But Ken went to Africa and he said, give me the hottest part of Africa. Could he be any more dedicated? And don't you find that a little insulting when Calvinists say he was never a Christian?
Yeah, I would find that very insulting, and I wouldn't agree with them. And I would also say, Ken, God's not through with you. And if you'll go back and read the poem, The Hound of Heaven, he's not through with you, brother. And I believe that. I truly do. I think if you, and Bill, I'm going to say the same for you, unless you've got some weird gene that makes you an evangelistic atheist, I don't understand why you'd even be engaging in these dialogues if there wasn't something within you that said, I've got to either prove this is right to myself so I can continue holding it, or I need to see if maybe there's something else to it. So
like I said, we're like on a different level. We're post-Christian, where we are familiar with Dale Allison. It's like a different, he's kind of like our patron saint. It's like we're on a different level now because we know all the problems. We know the contradictions. By the way, the thing about Paul being a homosexual, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. John Shelby Spong said that. And it's a minority view. I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, but there are people who say King David was a homosexual. And they King David was a homosexual.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
There are people who say all sorts of things that just don't seem that biblically based. And I will also tell you this: I went through a stage in my life where I was like you, and I bought into the liberal theology. But I learned my way out of it, and I'm optimistic you will too.
Hey guys, we'll take a couple more questions. I did want to take just a second to break in. If you have a question, try to get into the text. We'll get to as many as we can. I did want to talk about what's going on at our next upcoming book clubs. Just take a second. If you go to atheistchristianbookclub.com, we've already posted our last book club. We had Seth Andrews discussing his book, Christianity Made Me Talk Like an Idiot. Actually, ignoring the title, it was a good conversation. And Seth was very gracious, and I think we accomplished a lot in that. What we've got coming up, let me say first of all, we're going to hold open January for right now. We're not going to be able to do our normal time because the whole Watchman team, as well as actually Bill Cluck's going to be with us. We're all going to be at Dallas at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary for their Defend conference. Bill and I are going to be doing a dialogue, Atheist and Christian in Conversation. We're going to be doing that as one of the breakouts sessions at the Defend conference. So that's going to be taking place while the book club's normally scheduled. Daniel Ray has talked with a possible author, and listen, I'm really excited about this. It's going to be an atheist month. We're going to give this person any day they want in January, if they can do it in January. If not, we'll give them any day that they want later in the year. I can't give you the name right now. We're waiting to hear back if we can do a go for them in January. If they're somewhat open to the idea, they're discussing it right now. But we're talking about one of the top atheists. I'll give you a hint. One of the top 4 atheists, of which only 3 of the 4 are living. There's maybe a guest author at our book club. If so, we're going to hold open January any date that they want. If not, we'll try to squeeze it in later in the year if they can do it. We do also have a February 2nd. Our guest author is going to be Fuz Rana. He's going to be talking about humanism in his book, Humans 2.0. Is eternal life and a virtual heaven on earth possible apart from God? Is there a way through technology and medical breakthrough and some kind of singularity that we're going to be able to have a Methuselah effect in which eternal life is actually possible without there needing to be a God? So when we talk about that, that's the book coming up in February 2nd, so if you want to get that book and start reading it. And as far as our other guests, the atheist guests we're looking forward to, Christians, I want you to be praying about this. And atheists, keep your fingers crossed, or whatever you do, that would be great if we could have that special guest.
Hey,
So
if you get him, I'll pray.
okay, well, we'll count
Right,
on
Ken.
that. We'll
Isn't
count on
crossing
that.
your fingers, isn't that a sign of religion, like the cross?
It may be. So whatever. Think positive thoughts, but that sounds new age, doesn't it? So I don't know. Whatever you like to do. So do we have somebody else try to get a couple more questions squeezed in before the end?
Mike, you had a question, Mike Cahill. I think,
Sure.
if you wanna, go ahead.
Sure. I'm actually, for Mark, I'm a current member of Wycliffe Bible Translators, biochemistry undergraduate, linguistics PhD. So I appreciate the logical, reasoned approach that you put in your book, especially about the burden of proof, which we talked about, but the other things too, and especially the fact that a lot of atheists have arguments that really don't deal with the existence of God, but they're kind of red herrings, they're non sequiturs there. So I appreciate that. We've had a little bit of that tonight, not much. But the other thing is your scales there, I think, have one bit that may be a little bit unfair, because there's 2 points that you say, I don't know about beauty. That one can go either way. And I think your discussion of unanswered prayer was the same thing. So I was wondering, it's a very small graphic, to deal with, but it'd be nice to put those on the scale somehow too, just in the name of fairness on that.
Yeah, no, Mike, that's a great point. So I did get some, this book, IVP, is good about getting the books peer reviewed. So the book went to 3 peer reviewers. I don't know who they were. It's a blind process for the author. But
I'm involved in that process too.
Yeah. I got the comments back, and one of them took issue with me on the beauty point, and argued, as C.S. Lewis does, I believe, that beauty is evidence of God. The fact that none of us try to paint our walls to look like prison cell gray. We try real hard to add things that we all think are beautiful, and yes, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Here's my problem with why I can't go there. I put, let's go back to Ken's Bayesian analysis. I put in the scales only those things which, to me, I'm able to say more likely than not, they belong on this side of the scale.
Right.
I can make an argument that the reason we are all predisposed to think the same types of things are beautiful is because somewhere in the genetic selective breeding that we've gone through as a race, somewhere through the evolutionary process, we have had something in our brain makeup that causes us to all think some of the same types of features are beautiful. And so, for example, we have a lot of animals on our property. Among those animals are some peacocks. And the female peahens think that those male feathers are just absolutely worth having sex over. They think they're just as handsome and attractive and as wonderful as can be. Now, maybe that's a sign there's a God, but that could also just be a sign that the ones who have bred are the ones who liked the same thing as is going to cause them to breed. And so they're only going to breed with that. And so I look at the beauty argument, and I don't find it persuasive. It's certainly not persuasive that there is no God, so it doesn't belong on that side of the scales.
Right.
I'm not sure that I would say more likely than not that's proof there's a God. So I can't put it on my side of the scales. I know a lot of
the other angle is just a cross-cultural aspect. I don't think that all cultures regard everything the same as beautiful either.
Great point.
Well,
Mike.
and I've been in Africa longer than Ken did, I believe. I was there 11 years. What were you? Anyway.
Well, I don't want this to go away without me saying to both of you, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you did.
Okay.
I thank anybody I meet who's been in the military. I thank them for their military service, but y'all did kingdom service.
Yeah. The other thing I appreciate is I'm leading an academic writing and editing workshop in Nigeria in January. And a lot of your writing I could probably use as good examples for that. So that'll be helpful, I think.
Well, you've got freedom to quote me at any point in time. And if it helps for you to have copies of the books for anybody, I'll send you a case, or I'll send them to Africa. I'll send them wherever free of charge.
Okay, we'd need about 13 of them, I think. So
I'm glad you just get me the address, and I'll send however many you need.
Okay, how can I give them an address? Put it in the chat box, James, or what?
Let me, somebody's got my email address. Who's got my email address?
Somebody send me his email address. Yeah.
Dan has it. We'll get it to you, Mike.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Appreciate
pass it
that.
around. And Mike, I'll just tell me where to send them and how many you need, and err on the side of having too many.
Okay.
In fact, I might, and I'll also try and send you a set for everybody, or whomever wants one, email me, and I'll send you my newest book of Religions on Trial, the rest of the trilogy, if you will.
That'll be interesting too, yeah. So now I am, one of our lessons is on intellectual property rights. So I'm not just, quoting without attribution.
Yeah, fine. But I'm telling you, I don't care. My goal behind this, look, I've donated any royalties. I don't make a dime off these books. My goal is to write, to get the word out, not to do anything less. So
Appreciate that.
Hey, Brady, we have somebody else lined up.
I don't have anyone else. Dan, do you?
Nope.
Well, let me just say, I did have another question from earlier on. A couple of questions. You talked about the that there's a kind of a saying that goes around from both sides, atheists and Christians. You can't prove a negative, and that's kind of a logical issue, in the sense that if you say something like there is no God, you're implying some type of omniscience, like you've gone to every angle of the universe and you've seen the unseen world, and you can report there is no God. So it's almost like that impossible to prove a negative. But you said, and kind of from a different perspective, I believe that in trials you prove negatives all the time. So can you address that for just a little bit and talk about what do you mean by that?
You bet. So proof is proof. And remember what I define as proof. We prove negatives all the time. Doctors prove negatives all the time. I handle medical malpractice lawsuits. And one of the key requirements of a doctor is to do what's called a differential diagnosis. If someone presents with fever and certain other symptoms, and there may be 5 maladies that cause such, doctors have to prove that 4 of them don't apply, or 1 does. And they have to treat for 3 because they can only prove 2 don't apply. But they do a differential diagnosis. They make decisions all the time of what's yes and what's no. They prove a negative. It's not this, it's not this, and it's not this. Proving a negative is not impossible. It's done all the time. It's just look, there is laziness in academia, and there is laziness in armchair discussions. And it happens among the atheists, and it happens among the committed Christians. Some of the sloppiest scholarship I've ever seen in my life that would get you thrown out of court has been produced by Christian scholars, as Christian academics. Absolutely pathetic. And I can give example after example after example. And yet, it's just not the kind of scholarship that you should have if you're going to be rigorous. And the same is true from the atheistic perspective. I don't know which of the three surviving four horsemen of the apocalypse you're going to have perhaps in January, but whether it's Dennett or if you're going for the neuroscientist, he's got some of the sloppiest arguing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, his logic is just horrendous in the little rhetorical ploys he uses. And it's okay. And I'm sure I make lots of mistakes as well. I'm not trying to say I'm high and mighty on this, but we just have to be careful, because it's just real sloppy and easy to just say, oh, well, you can't disprove a negative. Well, yes, you can. You absolutely can.
Another one that comes up regularly in just coffee shop conversations and things like that, when the discussion turns to these issues like we talk about in the book club, is this idea that the evidence, a lot of the evidence that we have, like New Testament, we would talk about, there were eyewitnesses, their record is recorded to us, we have records of that. And they said, well, that's not really evidence because it's just hearsay. We don't have the actual person. So that's only hearsay, so it's not admissible. Or you'll hear it's circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence not admissible. But actually, circumstantial evidence is still circumstantial. You talk about this in your book. It's still evidence.
Yeah,
and so
evidence. Look, that is the most prevalent kind of evidence ever used in a courtroom. Any murderer who's been convicted, if you've got an eyewitness, it's not circumstantial evidence. But most of the time you don't have an eyewitness. Nobody's saying, gather around, watch this, I'm about to kill someone. Most of the time it's done, and you got to get a gun, you got to get a weapon, you got to show a motive. That's all circumstantial evidence. That's all circumstantial. Look, I have to prove motive in a fraud case. Nobody says, no, I've had many Perry Mason moments in the courtroom. I've tried more cases than I can count. I've had people cry on the stand. I've had people be turned into the DA for perjury on the stand. I have grilled people on the stand, but I've never had someone on the stand say, let me tell you why I intentionally defrauded this person. They don't do it, but I have to prove fraud. I have to prove intent. You do that through circumstances. It's all circumstantial evidence. And people who say, well, that's hearsay, they don't have a clue what hearsay is. Hearsay, the rules of court have evolved over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And they have developed exceptions to the hearsay doctrine. And hearsay itself has this real peculiar definition of what it is. And so until someone wants to not even just sit through an evidence class, but let someone jostle with the rules of evidence on hearsay, that's people say, well, that's hearsay. Well, cockamamie, that's not just hearsay. I mean, look, was it hearsay that we were going to have this meeting tonight? I mean, I was told we were going to have this meeting tonight through an email. I agreed to do it through an email. Here we all are. Oh, but we don't know. We may not be here because that was hearsay. Well, no, hearsay has a real specific definition on when you can apply it and when you can't, when it is hearsay, when it's not. That's laziness.
Well, listen, I greatly appreciate your patience and the sharing that you did and taking the time to answer our questions. I greatly look forward to being able to come down to Houston, spend some time with you. I look forward to having you back with one of the other book, especially Christianity on Trial. I think that would be great. Thanks so much. Do you have any parting? We're wrapping up on time, so do you have any parting words of advice for our atheist members and our Christian members?
Hey, Christian members, atheist members alike, let's don't quit striving for truth. Let's strive for truth, because there is truth. Truth is not an ambiguous, made-up concept of cosmic stardust, bags of chemicals. Truth really exists, and we need to find it, and we need to glob onto it in all of its glory. My 2 cents. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of our Atheist and Christian Book Club. Look forward to hopefully having a January meeting, and be watching on atheistchristianbookclub.com or on our Facebook page, Atheist and Christian Book Club. And until next time we meet, thank you so much.
Blessings on you.
Thank you, Mark.
Uh-huh.